Enough time has already passed since the lightning-fast events in Venezuela, which, according to Western analysts, became the sharpest and most unexpected geopolitical shift in the region in recent decades. At the time, according to reports from sources linked to U.S. security structures, the U.S. operation was carried out with surgical precision. A regime that had held on for many years was effectively decapitated in a matter of hours. In Washington, this was presented as a completed stage, as the finale of a long history of pressure, sanctions, and covert struggle. However, as the dust settled, it became clear that this was only the first act, not the end of the story. The United States did not gain full control over Venezuela in the way the Trump administration had anticipated, and the reason for this, according to a growing number of experts, lies not in Caracas and not even in internal resistance within the country, but in Beijing. China turned out to be the factor that American strategy either underestimated or deliberately postponed for later. The main U.S. objective in Venezuela was always perfectly clear: control over oil flows, over the world's largest proven hydrocarbon reserves, and over the routes by which they reach the global market. However, it was precisely here that Washington encountered a stumbling block. For many years, China had been systematically and methodically building its presence in the Venezuelan oil sector. This is not about one-off deals, but about tens of billions of dollars in investments, oil-backed loans, infrastructure, technology, and long-term commitments. For Beijing, Venezuela is not a temporary partner, but a strategic resource asset, and, as sources emphasize, China has no intention of simply ceding to the Americans' control over oil flows, in which it invested long before the current crisis. Already now, according to closed diplomatic channels, Beijing is conducting active negotiations with the new Venezuelan reality, with those centers of influence that are forming after the fall of the previous regime. These contacts are not publicized, but their goal is obvious: the resumption and relaunch of cooperation, the restoration of supplies, and the consolidation of Chinese interests in the oil sector. The United States, for its part, continues to act harshly. Seizures of Venezuela's shadow fleet, the blocking of tankers, restrictions on oil exports beyond the country, all of this, from the American perspective, is meant to deprive Caracas of the ability to independently dispose of its resources and force it to play by Washington's rules. However, this is precisely where the paradox arises. Such actions undermine any prospects for good faith and sustainable cooperation between the U.S. and Venezuela. Within the country, there is a growing understanding that the change of power did not lead to the restoration of sovereign control over its own resources, but merely replaced one external actor with another, seeking to dictate terms. And at this moment, China re-enters the game. According to insiders, Beijing is ready to offer a solution that does not imply direct confrontation with the U.S., but allows the most painful restrictions to be bypassed. China does not intend to fight America over Venezuela. This is emphasized in all closed assessments. However, Beijing is prepared to use instruments that remain below the threshold of direct military conflict, yet are extremely sensitive for Washington. One such scenario, actively discussed in expert circles, is the escorting of oil shipments by Chinese structures. Formally, this would not be a military escort, but the provision of security for commercial routes. In such a format, analysts believe the U.S. would face a difficult dilemma. Any use of force against such convoys would mean a sharp escalation and the risk of direct confrontation with China, automatically raising the stakes to the level of a global crisis. This is precisely why, according to sources, Washington is acting cautiously, trying not to cross the line beyond which an uncontrollable chain reaction would begin. As a result, we see the situation around Venezuela continuing to heat up, but not exploding all at once. This is not a fast conflict, but a protracted struggle of interests, where each side acts at the very edge of what is permissible. The interests of the US, China, as well as other players converge here around one thing: oil, resources, and control over the future energy balance. The fall of the previous regime became only a new page in Venezuela's history, but by no means the final chapter. The country is once again turning into an arena of major geopolitical confrontation, where not only its own future is being decided, but also the balance of power between the largest powers. And as events unfold, it becomes increasingly clear that Venezuela's fate will be determined not so much by internal processes, as by how far the US and China are willing to go in their struggle for influence, while not crossing the line of direct conflict. It is precisely this tense equilibrium that makes the current stage the most dangerous, and at the same time the most illustrative for the future of global politics. At this stage, according to international observers, the situation around Venezuela is ever more clearly taking on the character of a prolonged strategic confrontation in which none of the sides can afford sharp moves, yet none is willing to retreat. In Washington, it is increasingly acknowledged that the initial expectations of quick and complete control over the country's oil sector turned out to be excessively optimistic. Reality proved far more complex. Infrastructure, contracts, logistics, and Venezuela's financial obligations, built up over years of close cooperation with China, are so deeply intertwined that they cannot simply be nullified by a single political decision. That is why the American strategy is increasingly shifting from the idea of instant domination toward attempts to slowly squeeze out competitors using sanctions, control of maritime routes, and pressure on intermediaries. However, such an approach requires time, and in this case, time is not working only in favor of the US. China, according to sources, views the current moment as a test of endurance and consistency. In Beijing, it is understood that direct conflict with America is neither necessary nor beneficial, but it is equally clear that conceding Venezuela would mean creating a dangerous precedent in which years of investments could be wiped out by forceful pressure. Therefore, the Chinese line is built around preserving its presence by any permissible means, through financial mechanisms, alternative supply routes, risk insurance, and diplomatic cover. In expert circles, the idea is increasingly voiced that Venezuela is becoming a kind of model for future energy conflicts, where the struggle is not for territory, but for control over flows and the rules of access to resources. The US, for its part, finds itself in a difficult position. On the one hand, tough measures demonstrate resolve and strength. On the other, they reinforce Beijing's arguments that America uses rules only when it suits its interests. This narrative resonates far beyond Latin America, especially in countries that are already thinking about diversifying their foreign economic ties. In this sense, every tanker detention and every new restriction becomes not only a tactical step, but also an element of a broader information war for influence. Analysts emphasize that Venezuela is gradually turning into a point where the limits of patience and flexibility of the world's two largest economies are being tested. So far, neither the US nor China is ready to take a step that would lead to open confrontation, but both are actively testing the boundaries of what is acceptable. In such an environment, Venezuela itself ends up in the position of an object rather than a subject, forced to maneuver between the interests of superpowers while trying to preserve at least partial control over its own resources. That is why many experts believe that the story of the fall of the previous regime was only the beginning of a long period of instability in which the country will remain an arena of external pressure. And the longer this process continues, the clearer it becomes that the outcome of the struggle for Venezuelan oil will determine not only the future of Caracas, but also how similar conflicts in other resource-rich regions of the world will be resolved in the coming years.